This is the Conference of Africa and Asia that took place in 1955 right here. This is where President Sukarno gave his famous and incredible speech that was designed to bring together the developing countries after World War II in 1945. And it's very significant because, whereas a lot of other countries declared independence or merdeka in the 1960s, Indonesia was one of the few countries that actually declared it in 1945. I believe it's sometime in August of 1945. And so, of course, they didn't really have independence. The Dutch actually kidnapped a lot of people and started to create problems by moving their operations to Yogyakarta. But at least, you have a lot of history out here because in 1955, certainly at that point in time, you had an opportunity for a lot of these developing countries to establish some kind of independence, or at least some kind of, separation from colonial powers. And of course, in this country, that would mean the Dutch and the British and so on and so forth. This is the Merdeka building, which just means freedom building. Independence Day is actually also considered to be, the word Merdeka. So if you hear the word Merdeka, it means freedom and independence. Let me see if I can go ahead and give you a better view. But ultimately, let me give you some of the backdrop. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to come here is because Malcolm X, in one of his speeches, mentions the Bandung Conference and how scared people were in the West at the fact that that the so-called colored people were coming together and trying to create a future without the West. And what's interesting about that statement is that Sukarno and others specifically disavow the idea that this was going to be an Islamic conference or a colored conference. And they did that in part by inviting people who were, part of, for example, one of them was a priest from Cyprus who was trying to gain independence for the Cypriots minority community. So there was a lot of propaganda. A lot of these conferences are basically, propaganda. That's the best I can do with all the traffic. Let me go around the other way where it might be a little bit more quiet. There's an incredible Hulk actor that hangs out here and gives a lot of people some entertainment, just busking. How are you? Saw you yesterday. See you again, buddy. All right, and so let's talk about the drama that was going on. You had so many interesting speeches. What was happening at that time, post World War II, was just the fact that would you be able to be non-aligned? And this is part of the alignment movement. And so, or would you have to throw your lot in with the West, with the colonizers, because they had better technology, because they had more resources post World War II? And so there was a lot of drama about, who was going to be able to, come together and create some sort of economic cooperation. And as part of that drama, you had a situation where some countries were just not invited. And so most significantly, of course, you had Taiwan, Korea, and Israel, who were not invited. Excuse me. And so, one more time, I guess. I'm right under some beautiful trees over here. And my allergies are picking up, I think. But so you have this situation where, you can really sort of almost predict the future, right? You have very technologically advanced countries in Taiwan today, especially South Korea. But at this point in time, in 1955, the reason they were ostracized by everyone else is precisely because they sided with the West. And Israel at one point is called out as nothing more than a military base in the Middle East designed to antagonize developing countries that are now free to pave their own way. Let me see if I can find a quieter spot over here. And so you've got this, fascinating opportunity to give a lot of different speeches. Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, the politician in Pakistan, gives a speech. But the ones that really stand out are, of course, Sukarno from Indonesia, and the Philippines and India. And so, remember at that time, and you can see, you can see sort of effects today. Because right now, of course, you have a Ukrainian war with the Russians, And India did not vote on the most recent resolution along with the allied aligned powers with the West. And so ultimately, you had a situation where you can actually trace back India's abstention to what happened here, where Nehru has actually said, listen, when the West goes to war, it wants its wars to be everyone else's problem. But why should the Western wars be our problem? And of course, he says it much better than I did, and it's a speech you should look up. But you see a lot of fascinating issues over here simply because you see how history is still relevant, 70, 80, 90 years, 50 to 90 years later. And you can also see, of course, the exchange of essentially a loss of sovereignty for a lot of these countries that did align themselves with the West in 1955 rather than push forward. And of course, you see a lot of tragedies because, you look at the invitees and you had Ceylon, which no longer exists. It's Sri Lanka. You had two separate Vietnams. You had the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and then you had just the state of Vietnam. And obviously they could not resolve their differences here because, of course, they went to war shortly after the conference. And so there's, you can look at it and say, well, obviously, on an economic GDP basis, there's no question that South Korea made the right choice. And even though it was ostracized here, there's no question that Israel made the right choice, even though it was ostracized here by the Arab countries. And, what's interesting, however, is that if you look at the economic development, you can also say that the fact that this country here is not as economically developed has allowed it to maintain its culture a little bit better, despite the fact that Indonesia was also colonized by several European countries. Whereas it's questionable whether or not, a lot of what is produced in Korea can really be maintained separately from the infrastructure, the military industrial complex, and the other infrastructure that supports the West. And, I happened to see some K-pop performers in Jakarta, actually, in one of the sporting events. And what struck me was just the fact that they seemed to have copied all of their dance moves from Michael Jackson. In other words, there are 5-6 people essentially copying Michael Jackson's dance moves. So, over here, of course, you have this effort to maintain at least some semblance of a connection to the past. Whether that's based on its Islamic heritage or differences in designs and so on and so forth. It's interesting that they're able to do it that way, despite the fact that you really probably have to be an expert to be able to trace back the differences in design and lettering from Sulawesi to Flores and so on and so forth, to Java and so on and so forth. But the other interesting subplot is the Philippines. So the Philippines, of course, has always been caught between the West and the East. And what's interesting is that the Philippines was invited, but people were very much questioning what was happening because the secondary subplot was the fact that Taiwan was given recognition by the UN, I believe, or at least some sort of, not official recognition, but at least some recognition by the Western-led United Nations. Whereas China, which of course, had a revolution under Mao, was not given recognition officially. And so that was the other subplot, was, the losers of the Chinese Revolution who were essentially kicked out to the island of Taiwan, or I believe it might have been called Formosa back then. There were so many different names back then. I just saw another name in a postal office museum for the stamps. And so, Chinese Taipei and so on and so forth. But the subplot there was, how is it possible that the international diplomatic bodies are refusing to recognize China and yet are continuing to recognize Taiwan, which is the breakaway province at that time. And so China was well aware that it did not want to be the focal point of attention for this conference. And so it played, you don't really see any sort of moving speeches by the by the Chinese delegation. Permisi? Makasi? And so I was just in the way of this worker over here, and I'm just getting my coat. And so you've got this other subplot. Now, the Philippines, of course, was going to vote. There's apparently, from what I can make out, an upcoming vote on whether or not to recognize China. It's essentially whether or not to seat them in the delegation in the UN. And nobody knew how the Philippines would vote. Even after reading the speeches, I still don't know how the Philippines voted. And so you have a situation where what was really interesting is the Philippine delegation gave one of the best speeches here, without question. So if you wanted to just, sort of look at the best speeches, you want to look at, of course, Sukarno, Indonesia, the Philippines, and then India. Those would be the ones that just really stood out. Everyone else was sort of very much, holding the cards to the chest, promising future cooperation. And in fact, you did see a lot of future cooperation through the 1960s, in different ways. There was an Asia-Africa Islamic conference. There were journalism conferences between the two continents, going back and forth. But again, you also have this tragic underside where you really had a hard time competing with the technological advances of the victors of World War II, which had built its economic infrastructure, and post-World War II had put other countries in massive debt to the point where it was essentially, well, Germany, of course, would not pay off its debts until 2010, I believe, and so right around that time. And so you had all these winners and victors of World War II able to leapfrog over a lot of these countries that appeared here because of World War II. But when you're sitting here thinking about what happened in 1955, you also have this other subplot of nuclear war, where you've just had the Japanese destroyed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as a result, you have a lot of people questioning, how they're going to move forward, given the fact that this deadly weapon has changed everything. Even 10 years after the fact, you're still trying to figure out what's happening. And again, that of course mimics what's happening now. It resembles a lot of the same issues that are happening today, with Iran, with North Korea, and a lot of other countries that are seeking nuclear independence. And so you start to realize that because these countries were not part of the technological sort of advancements and cooperation of the West, you still have these problems today, where the lack of cooperation between the East and the West has resulted in, breaches of confidence and trust that have allowed and caused a lot of developing countries to get together themselves. And, you see now a very clear position between an alliance starting to form between China and Russia. And what's amazing about that, of course, is that the Japanese were considered, if you look at the speeches here, were considered to be the first country that defeated Europe. At that time, everyone here considered the Russians to be part of Europe. And so they constantly, conflate the Europeans with the Russians. And, that's something that's really interesting, because they don't do that with the Philippines, obviously, even though it's also a Christian country. But they did that with the Russians. And the reason for that is because, they mentioned the fact that when the Japanese defeated the Russians in a war, I think that took place in the early 1900s, what happened was that was the first time an Asian power had defeated, quote unquote, a European power. And so you've got this other subplot. Now, and again, because these diplomatic issues have still festered with, transfers of technology and so on and so forth, you've got a situation now where the result of all of that might be closer Asian-Russian ties, and just the inability of Russia to be able to eventually shift into an EU situation or a European delegation situation. So this is just amazing when you think about what was happening here. And it's just the fact that Sukarno's speech is better than the I Have the Dream speech that took place with Martin Luther King in the United States. It's incredible because it touches upon so many different things in such a short period of time. And yet it's not something that's studied in any American school that I know of, at least not at the high school level. And here we have the Incredible Hulk again. So I think that's what I have now. It's about 15, I'm approaching the 15-minute mark. How are you? Very nice. So we'll go, yep, I got you on the video. So we got that. So again, a lot of history happened over here. Hello. And, at the very least, what you ought to do is just check out Sukarno's speech. S-U-K, spelled different ways, but S-U-K-A-R-N-O. Speech, Bandung Conference, 1955. That would be the easiest way to look at it. And if you have time, of course, look up the India speech by Nehru. And, of course, try to look at the Philippines speech. And I get the sense that the other speeches did not come across as well, simply because of the inability to translate properly. Anytime you translate something from, say, Arabic or a script language into a non-script language, of course you're going to lose a lot in that process. So it may very well be that the other speeches, that the non-Indian, and the non-Philippine speeches were just as good. But if you only speak and read English, obviously, the British colonized India. So obviously there's just it's a lot easier for them to come up with speeches in English. And that's that. Here we are, and hopefully we can have something that involves a little bit more than repeats of the past. But if you come to Bandung, you just notice there's a lot of history out here that deserves to be told.